Thank you. So I think if we talk about mistakes in medical research, then there is a whole spectrum of things that can go wrong. And on one end, that is wrong observation and wrong analysis, just unintentional errors. And on the other side of the spectrum, there is illegal human experiments, but just above that, there is data fabrication and falsification. So that goes from intentional to non-intentional. It goes from error to fraud. And this figure also says easily detected, difficult detected. I'm not so sure where it's all easily detected. But what I will do in this talk, I will address fabrication. So my story starts with this article. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist trained in the Netherlands with a vast interest in clinical epidemiology. I consider my core business making medical knowledge, and I'm passionate about it because I think it will generate a little bit of a better world if we are informed about what we're doing. So I was not involved in detecting this case. This was a retracted article at some stage, but the story is that there is a study on polyps, a randomized trial published from Spain. And then a little bit later, there is a study on myomas that are removed from Dr. Shokir from Egypt. And the first one is published Human Reproduction. The second one is Fertility, Sterility, two high impact journals. But if you look careful at the abstracts, then there is actually a lot of similarity. So it's both 215 patients, and then 93 of these patients get pregnant, and then the distribution is 64-29, and that's exactly the same in both studies. And if you're not convinced, then look at the baseline table of both articles. So this is different interventions. It's claimed to be different studies, but the age, the mean age is exactly the same. And the distribution of polyps, myomas, is also exactly the same. So this was discovered, and it led to retraction, which is a kind of euphemistic text like there was duplication. I think that's fabrication. But from that moment on, I was kind of alerted. And then when I worked as an editor, I got, as I said, I got more alerted. So I saw this paper submitted to the journal that I was working for, and there were inconsistencies. So 340 patients in the table, but only 140 in the abstract. So I wrote to the authors and asked some questions. And then the authors disappeared. But later on, the paper was published elsewhere, and then the authors had kind of changed the things where I put my finger on, but you can clearly see that this is the same article. So with the evidence of the earlier submission, this paper was retracted, took a year or so. And then a student came to Melbourne from the Netherlands, Esme Bordewijk, and she was doing meta-analysis in polycystic ovary syndrome. That was the topic of her PhD. And I said, well, have a look at these particular studies. And after a couple of days, she comes back and she says, well, there is a problem with these studies because this author, Dr. Badawi, actually copies tables from one article to the other. So what you see here is two different articles reporting on two different studies and different interventions, but the mean values are very comparable. So each green dot means exactly the same number. Each red dot means 1 point difference. And that didn't happen once, but it happened in a lot of tables. So Esme summarized it all, and here you can see the 18 studies of Badawi, and then red means that there are more than 10 similarities in baseline or outcome variables. So I think that proves that at least a substantial part of these papers is fabricated. And the problem is obviously these papers are published in high impact journals and they are cited. So if you look into the influential guidelines on PCOS, also come from Melbourne, Helen Teed, then 13 citations actually come from these authors, Abu Hashim and Badawi. So that is the summary of the problem as I was confronted with. Then, and I will not talk too long about that, what can you do about that? Well, I think an important moment is submission of papers. I saw a couple of editors and people working at editorial boards among the audience. That's great because it's really important that they are alerted to this problem. And then secondly, during meta-analysis, you can study the work of more than one author. So one of the problems with the papers I just showed, if you see one paper of that author, you're not going to see it. But if you assess them all at the same time, you see more problems. Ask the author. And in the end, usually in my experience, asking for individual participant data will solve the job because it's really very difficult to mimic all these false data the right way. So then when I was alerted, I looked at other papers that were published. This is a randomized clinical trial from Dr. Maher from Manufia University. Was an unfeasible big sample size, fast recruitment, positive treatment effect. So I wrote a letter to the editor. I bring things in the public domain because it helps giving you timelines, etc. And then I asked the editor for the data because the editor says, yeah, Ben, I knew the editor actually. And he said, yeah, Ben, we have seen the data and it all looks okay. So I said, well, can I see the data? And he said, no, not allowed. And then there was a bit of email correspondence also with the author. And then at some stage, the author said, please ask the editor to provide you with a copy for the data. Thanks. And then Dwight Rouse said to me, here are the data. And then I got the data set, so I was nervous. And I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to find anything, right? Making all this noise. But this is actually the data set underlying that randomized clinical trial that I just showed, where you can see already that poor outcomes, low EPCOR score, low pH, are ordered at yes and no. But then if you look into amniotic fluid index, that is for 9,87654. And then, right, so it counts just down. Well, this doesn't happen in a genuine data set. And maybe you could say the data set is sorted in a particular way, but this color sheet indicates how many strings we found in that data set. So that paper is retracted now. That was also a long story, but this indicates actually that if you get raw data, then you know that there is a problem. So we have worked on that, and I have now raised concerns about 900 different articles. And from that experience, we have developed a checklist that we call the tracked checklist. Lyle Gurren is in the audience, also contributed to that work. And basically what we say, well, if you see a paper, and specifically a randomized clinical trial, look at the following things: governance. Is the study registered? How does the registration compare to the published paper? Author group, small number of authors is suspicious. Authors with previous problematic papers. Plausibility of the intervention use. Time frame. I work in obstetrics and reproductive medicine. If you study IVF and you report on live birth, then you need at least 9 months before you can report it. And there is a remarkable number of studies that doesn't fulfill that criteria. Dropouts, so papers are with 0 dropouts, that's suspicious. Rounded numbers, study with only even numbers. You can look at baseline characteristics. Randomized clinical trials should have a particular distribution of baseline characteristics. If they're too close together or too far apart, it doesn't work. And you can look at outcomes and compare the effect to other studies. So I think this works quite good. It's not kind of proving, but it alerts you whether something is wrong. And then, as I said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You should ask for ethics documents and raw data. So this could be, kind of a thing that you talk about during a drink and you say, oh, that's not very nice, but yeah, right. I mean, there's so many literature. So don't worry about this incidental paper. So the important question is, how big is this problem? So what you can do is you can look at retracted. Retraction Watch is a fantastic website where all papers with retractions and expressions of concern are exposed. But the problem is that the process of retraction is very slow, very time intensive. And there is, I must say, a reluctance with editors and specifically publishers to retract papers. So this is not a good measure. So this shows that I think the number of retracted papers is 1 in 1,000 or even lower. Better estimates come from other sources. This is John Carlisle, he's an anesthesiologist, works for the journal Anesthesia. And he, as one of the few editors for a long time already, assesses the underlying data from the studies that are submitted. And he published a couple of years ago that in terms of false data, that varies depending on the country, somewhere between 20 and 90%. And he also talks about zombie studies these are studies that completely do not exist. And he found also that percentage in studies submitted to his journal is high, I would say. China, for example, 36%. So John Ioannidis wrote an editorial or commentary about that and said, well, if this number is true, then there must be hundreds of thousands of these RCTs around us. So I'll take you back now to my own field, gynecology, and show what meta-analysis does. So the best way, I think, to assess the prevalence of the problem is individual participant data meta-analysis, where you ask for the original data. And together with a group of people led by Leslie Stewart, we have done that. I was part of that group. Studies on progesterone to prevent preterm birth. And from the 49 available studies, and these relatively recent studies, 31 shared data. So from Europe, 9 out of 10, from North America, 14 out of 15. Australia was the best, 1 out of 100%. But the problem came from, unfortunately, the Middle East, 3 out of 10. And Africa, Egypt, 1 out of 6 shared data. Another topic, endometrial scratching, that is a treatment that is given to infertile couples. A meta-analysis published with about 25 papers. We have approached all the authors, and we can get only data sets of 4 of these people. 1 or 3 from India and 1 from the UK, and the others do not share data. This is around spontaneous conception. We have also done it for IVF, in vitro fertilization, and there similar numbers. So more than half of the people do not share data, and the people who do not share come from Iran, Egypt, China, and 5 from individual other countries. This is our journal club every Thursday. And unfortunately, there is meta-analysis discussed, and that is also infiltrated with these problematic studies, including Cochrane. I work as an editor for Fertility Sterility. I do the meta-analysis. Sorry, that is the next slide. This is an important slide. This is a meta-analysis on tranexamic acid for the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. So we talk about the most important cause of maternal death in pregnancy around the world, hemorrhage during labor. If you look into a meta-analysis published in the American Journal, this is a high-impact journal, then the estimate is that the use of tranexamic acid reduces blood loss more than a liter with more than 60%. Majority of the studies from India, Iran, Egypt, and 2 from China. This week, the New England Journal of Medicine published a large study from the US with 5,000 women that estimates that blood loss more than 1 liter actually is not reduced by TXA. So the difference here is 7.3 versus 8%, so there is an 0.7% reduction with a non-significant relative risk of 0.91. So this slide summarizes the problem. This is the most important cause of death of women around the world. If you look into conventional meta-analysis, you think that TXA is a fantastic treatment. It is reported in one of our leading journals, the American Journal. But if you do the big trustworthy RCT, then the treatment effect is completely not there. Keep that in mind. Everybody online, and I saw a couple of names of people who are really involved in this problem, this is what you are dealing with. This is my role as an editor. I was next to the slides. I do the systematic reviews. Almost every systematic review has potential problematic papers in it. Work of others, a meta-analysis on tocolysis to prevent preterm birth. A Cochrane review out of the, what is it? So 122 trials included, but 44, so 25% excluded because they don't trust the data. Ivermectin in COVID, a similar amount of papers included. And recently we have compared for a series of topics the number of papers that we lose in different individual participant data meta-analysis. And that is somewhere between 40 and 60%. And it has major impact on the conclusions from these meta-analysis. So based on what I just showed, I think that an estimate that 30% of the randomized clinical trials in my field, women's health, are fabricated. And well, it's for you to assess whether you think that is a concern or not. Sensitive topic. Another sensitive issue is that unfortunately these studies come in majority from particular parts of the world. So if you look at the total number of randomized clinical trials in women's health in relation to the gross national product, then Egypt and Iran are producing the most RCTs and maybe much more than you could actually expect from the number of resources available. And then China and India are also big contributors in absolute terms. If you look at Retraction Watch, all scientific papers retracted, then China, Russia, Iran, Malaysia, Egypt, and India are the main contributors there. So how do we deal with this problem? And I go back to the studies of Badawi and Abu Hashim, where I started. So we published on that 3 years ago now, more than 3 years, an overview of what was happening. And some authors or some journals have responded and have investigated and retracted or have put an expression of concern. But that process of assessment by the journals is going incredibly slow. So this is a Kaplan-Meier curve that estimates the time till decision. So this is from the moment that I write to the journal until I hear something. And after 1 year, only 25% of the journals has come up with a response. So 75% of the journals takes more than a year to respond. We have no system in place that if an author has a problematic article, that we assess all the work of that author, right? So Lance Armstrong, when he lost Tour de France victories because of doping, lost everything at some stage, but he was not positive or tested positive in every single race. This is how some universities respond. So COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, says you should go back to the institute. This is Manufia University. I showed an earlier trial there. It has come up now with a statement where they say data are not longer than 2 years collected in our center. This is another a trial. This is also from Manufia. This is a big study on hypertension in pregnancy. The left paper was published first. It is a 550 women, 520 women study with 3 arms. I already asked questions in a letter to the editor because I thought that the study was unfeasible back. But then a year later, in another journal, the same group published a similar study where 2 of the 3 treatment arms are the same. Well, this is really completely impossible, obviously. And if you're not convinced, then if you look into the 2 outcome tables, there are actually many numbers completely the same. And all the numbers are even numbers. So I have flagged this 3 years ago, and these papers are still not retracted. And here we go. Here comes the meta-analysis in the American Journal, and they use these papers, right? So I wrote to the American Journal. I said, listen, we are Boeing. We know that the software of our planes is wrong, and we keep on flying them, right? The American Journal refuses to retract this meta-analysis or adjust this meta-analysis until the original papers are retracted. And Elsevier is really taking, I don't know, 2 or 2.5 years. It's completely unacceptable, of course. So what does this mean? This is another response. So I told you already, we make these overviews of particular authors. And the reason to do that is to bring things in the public domain, and that really gives an extra dimension, so to say. So we made an overview of one author, I can't come up with the name here, who had Abdel Salam, who had really had, I don't know how many problematic papers. And then the paper is now rejected because they didn't dare to publish it, but they say, oh, it has to go to an internal legal read at the cost of approximately $500. And we had another paper where the editor had accepted the paper for publication, but the Springer then said, we are not going to publish this overview. And the editor then wrote to us, Springer has informed me that publication of the manuscript would be inadvisable for legal reasons. For myself as an editor-in-chief, yourself as authors, well, we already had it as a pre-publication out there, and the journal and the publisher. And therefore, they are not going to publish. And they refer to COPE, but the problem is that these papers are not properly and timely assessed under COPE. I think, given the fact that I just showed you that we misinform women and practitioners on the wrong treatments for example, postpartum hemorrhage, that this is completely criminal. I'm now going to give you an overview of the successful legal claims of an author against a publisher or editor for an expression of concern or retraction. Here is the overview. It is completely nothing, right? So these lawyers really are afraid for a risk that is not existing. And the interest of patients and the interest of science is not on the table. One story, see how we go with time, but this is an interesting journey also. So this was an overview. I do that often with students. So Mai Miat Lin, who was working as a student in Australia, she's now a young doctor, wrote an overview of the work of Dr. Torquay, and we got it published actually in a French journal. So here are the RCTs that Dr. Torquay publishes. We always plot the moment of registration and the running of the trials and when the trials are submitted. So there was one case of clear plagiarism, that the paper was retracted. One other paper was retracted. There is a paper with only even numbers, so that should be retracted. But interestingly then, somebody in Egypt actually read our paper and told us, well, if you talk about Dr. Torquay, then I can give you a little bit more information. So he went to the library and he actually copied for us the original thesis that Dr. Torquay uses to create his articles. But the theses are not written by, or supervised by Torquay. He just gets them from another supervisor. So this Prof. Mustafa supervises thesis and then sends it to Torquay, and Torquay makes an article of that. And it doesn't happen once or twice, but here we go. I'll not give you all the details, but this happens in an enormous amount of papers. And this is already also known with the publishers of these relevant journals since December, and there is no expression of concern published. This is the German Zeitschrift für Geburtshilfe und Frauenheilkunde. They also have a copied paper. I wrote to the editor, and the editor, I'm going to speak out his name, Professor Matthias Wilhelm Beckmann, says also, das lassen wir jetzt mal so. Keine weitere Reaktion. So no further action. I really cannot believe that. Another example, if we close off, this is two RCTs published in Fertility, Sterility, same author involved, El Inani, and then if you look careful, and interestingly, the affiliation of the last author, Abu Seta, is from Canada, which also allows you would hope, a little bit more ground for investigation. So the problem with these two RCTs is similar to what I showed in the beginning, copying of numbers in a way that is not explained by chance. So red is one digit different, green is the same number. I've written to the authors, I never got an explanation for that. As this affiliation is in Canada, I wrote to Alberta, and the dean wrote back to me, the research presented in the manuscript in question was neither conducted or nor approved by University of Alberta, so I am not going to do anything about it. But this last author, Abu Seta, actually had an appointment in Alberta when it happened. And with this logic, you can investigate no zombie trials because they have obviously never conducted ever. And then I wrote to Dr. Zarikansky, who has published with Dr. Abu Seta, and I asked him maybe to ask Abu Seta, and he said, I don't have time for that, and it's not my bandwidth, blah, blah, blah. But interestingly, I wrote to this Zarikansky because he has actually published in JAMA a meta-analysis where he looks at the impact of fabricated papers. And look who is the second paper in that JAMA article. That is Dr. Abu Seta, who is a fabricator himself. I mean, it is really unbelievable that people do not stand up against this. So this is the responses of editors. I really don't have time for this. The journal gets 80 submissions a week. It exists in all specialties and in every country. We cannot keep up with the number of complaints you send us. Yeah, that's because you publish so many problematic articles. We are working on it, be patient. And the last one this week was your assertions about us and about Elsevier are therefore ill-informed and wrong. Moreover, their insulting implications do not serve any productive collaboration. So this is a journal that has published 100% fake papers And they're still out there more than 3 years after I flagged them. The consequence for myself is that all my papers are being attacked by various peoples, which in itself should be okay, because I'm critical on others. I should also be exposed. But I wonder, specifically, I would say, not so much even to the fabricators, but to the wider academic community, why I and a couple of others, Jim Thornton, Lyle Gurin here at the meeting speak out, but why only a few people speak out and not everyone? This was a nice email I got from a group of editors, including Roberto Romero from the American Journal. You can't constantly lie and expect people to trust you. The paper that we discussed is retracted now. And this is another kind of the type of emails that are sent by fabricators who start to accuse me in very wide CCs. And the last product is from last week. BJOP, and one of the leading obstetric journals, has now published an international multi-center stakeholder consensus statement on clinical trial integrity done by what's in the name, the Cairo Consensus Group on Research Integrity, where if there are not fabricators in that group, then they are very close to fabricators. And the problem here is not so much this stakeholder paper. The problem is that we don't speak clearly out to these fabricators that this type of behavior is unacceptable. We give them a feeling that they can get away with it. I think that is so wrong from BJOP to do that. So there was already referred on the Economist article. So there was attention for this topic in the Economist. I think a very well-written article. And one of the comments was, I recently saw your name in an article. It seems crazy to me that the topic of fraudulent medical research was brought up by a non-medical journal. I think that is a very important sentence also. I think that medicine has a lot of problems in addressing this issue. So this keeps me going. Facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. The problem is there. And in summary, data fabrication, there are areas where it happens. There is a lack of governance. Peer review does not detect it. But the main problem is the majority of the academic community is looking away. I think the problem in RCTs, which are the most informative studies or most important studies, is as high as 30%. We're able to detect it, and the biggest challenge are at the level of governance, but also our behavior. And with that, I give back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Ben. Breathtaking. So thank you for all these details. We have one question in the chat already. I'm looking forward to seeing your hands. Please go ahead. Ben, perhaps you can start with a question from Lawrence, who proposes replication study publication as one of the solutions. Also data availability. So the question is, what can we do to change medical journals culture to actually publish replication papers and to improve on transparency?
My comment on that?
Florence, if you want to add something, please go ahead, and then Beth can respond.
I was just going to say, coming from the world of patient safety, trying to prevent recurrence of medical errors, and then economic journals who do it by not only making their authors requiring their data and codes to be available to others, but then they publish them. You know, they publish the replication papers. Medical journals, I've found out through many people, and editors have admitted that they don't publish them, not the individual replications. And most people, unlike our great speaker, cannot do the arduous work to do it if they're not published. They've got to pay their bills. They're not going to be promoted if they're not published. So that's my question is, how do we encourage medical journal editors to be transparent and publish replication papers? You know, what have y'all seen? JAMA Internal Medicine, I've seen, is the best at doing it, but most of JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, I've been told authors, they just blow them off. Anyway, so that's it. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, replication papers are important, but they are also important in the absence of fraud, I would say. I mean, apart from, I think I hear many people also discuss these people say, well, industry is involved and research in itself is not reliable. But I'm particularly motivated to address this topic of fabrication because I think the other problems should be resolved by discussion and improving our systems. But if we can't trust the underlying data, yeah, that's the end of every discussion, so to say, right? So what I say is we know that industry tries to manipulate their findings because they do it driven by profit, obviously, so they want to have positive findings. But I believe, and I have no indication that the data underlying the industry studies are wrong. Similarly, or are wrong or fabricated. Similarly, replication studies, yeah, that is needed, and it's said that New England and JAMA, et cetera, only want to publish new findings for the first time. But then the replication studies end up in a bit of lower impact journals, but they are still true. What we talk here about is just completely fake data. Right? It's from a different level.
Susan, please go ahead, but there is another point from Florence in the chat, and I guess my question to Florence, yes, it doesn't give it perhaps an academic credit, but replication papers can definitely be uploaded on servers, preprint servers, and information can be available there as extra support. So just a comment. So Susan, do you have a question or?
Well, I want to thank Ben as a great fan of his for a very long time, and also just ask his advice about, following him on this road. Our friend Jim Thornton and I, we're all looking at these things. I've got a paper. I had to find someone to pay $599 to get a letter to the editor about something that made no sense, riddled with errors. There's been an investigation, supposedly, a statistician looked at it, supposedly, they haven't bothered to answer the letter. I think it must be made up. I think it must be fraud. And I'm getting absolutely nowhere with the editors of the journal. I'll put the tweet in if anyone wants to look at it. But I don't want to waste my time. I don't want to give up. But where do you go when you've got authors who refuse to discuss something which is not replicable because they haven't even put in the methods, basic data to replicate it? I think it is unscientific, possibly fraud, to have a paper which has methods that are not replicable and full of errors. And I'm dealing with an editor-in-chief who said, oh, we followed all the COPE guidelines. I mean, it's bollocks, but where do we appeal? If we have no international rules, governance systems, won't you just be batted back forever? I don't want to make me or you dismal, but please give me your advice.
Well, I would say don't give up and bring what you think is important to light. I think transparency is an important word. You referred to COPE. I think the COPE processes are not equipped to deal with the mass fabrication that I discussed here. So I'm going to be mild here. But COPE, I think, is made or set up by people who think that there might be an individual dispute between two authors who have an academic competition, and then nobody knows exactly who's right and who's wrong, etc., etc. but so then you have to go to the institute and they have to investigate. But that completely doesn't deal with the mass fabrication that we are talking about here. And sometimes I find myself in a position that I'm the accuser, and then the editor seems to be a kind of a neutral role. I mean, to all the editors, I saw a couple online also. I'm a researcher who just want to do research, right? I'm just speaking out because it's unacceptable. I'm not a party here. I mean, I think it's really ridiculous that people are going to sit somewhere in the middle to judge it. And the other thing is, they call us, what is it, sleuth. I don't like this word. Sleuth, like data sleuths, you have to look careful where you see. I mean, you really must be a blind cow if you don't see the problems in these papers, right? So how on earth can that be? And the answer is there should be much more transparency. All the data should just be available. I saw Julie Hastings from Human Reproduction online. There is an author there who hides behind an expert report from someone else and says, I'm not going to share the data. The journal should just put that online, right? They should say, we have asked the author for the data and he is not sharing that. And then everybody knows that you shouldn't use that stuff. Mm-hmm. But that is not possible.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, it would be an ideal world if we obliged every journal to require full data access.
Well, they should oblige themselves.
Indeed, indeed. Ian, please go ahead, and then David.
Yeah. I saw one comment in the chat that I don't want to miss. That was from a PhD student in the Netherlands, which I think is Dr. Shakralia, who apologized that she's from Egypt. Let me apologize to Dr. Shakralia. I struggle with this issue in that inevitably I point at particular countries, etc., etc., and I just don't know how to deal with it. Because if I speak out, I point at particular countries, and if I don't speak out, I'm not honest to the quality of care, patients, science, etc. But let me say that under the level of the importance for patients, there is also the importance for science. But there is also the argument of justice to many people in these countries who actually do honest research, right? And they are affected too. So the editors and the publishers should realize that if they don't speak out, they are also harming the many people who do trustworthy research in these countries and who actually do a lot of effort. So I saw your question, Dr. Shukalia, and good luck with your PhD. And I'm not sure, but I think if you're from Egypt, I should also say Eid Mubarak to you. Next question.
Thank you, Ben. We do have another question in the chat, and I will read it after we hear from Ian and David. So Ian, please go ahead.
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk. One of the things that occurred to me is the fabricators you described are not very good at it. And it really raises the question. I am not a fabricator, but if I were, I think I'm bright enough to do a much better job. And that suggests that you're 30%, although I think it's a little bit biased by the fact that they are coming from some of these countries where there's less control than in some others. But those who are better at it are probably getting away with it much more. Do you have comments on that?
No, I think that's true. I think that's true. And the other concern is that if we put this information that I just shared with you out there, that the fabricators will read this checklist and they will produce better papers. So I think the checklist and the fraud detection will specifically be good for what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years. But moving forward, we should be much more proactive and just get all the data sets on the table, so to say. I believe, however, that if you ask for original data, well, that's going to be pretty reliable. And you can also go and ask for institutes and arounds if studies were really done. If we really get more transparency and also people from that countries who are trustworthy, then we know whether studies actually happened or not. You can ask that. I showed one example where somebody saw my article and gave a lot of extra information. That has actually happened already 3 times to me, indicating that there are also a lot of people around who want to do the good thing. And I think if we reach out to these people, then this problem is repairable.
Thank you, Ben. David, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, I've published mostly in the Journal of Physiology and Royal Society journals, and it never occurred to me that people would actually make up data. 30% is an astonishing number. Is it something to do with medicine, or is it?
Could be. I mean, the reason I see it, I think, is that I am a researcher and a clinician. So I in my own field, I can see more than others see, and I could not see what I see in obstetrics in the field of cardiology or neurology or so. But you touch upon a deeper point that I mean, given that last editorial response that I got last week, that they think I'm insulting by asking what about their investigations that go on for 3 years. I mean, that editor actually hid behind the publisher, and I said, well, you have an editorial response too. I'm afraid that there might even be a layer deeper, that the problem is not only in research, but the problem is with medicine as a profession in itself. Now, this is going to be tricky, but maybe we are even afraid to really allow good science to do the job in medicine, because that threatens medicine as a field also, and that's the reason why we don't want to speak up. I'm afraid that these mechanisms play. Medicine is a very conservative field, so to say. You're once you are a doctor, you're part of that group. That group gives you a good life, but don't dare to be critical outside the group. I think these mechanisms play a much bigger role than we think they do.
Thank you for your response. And David, I pasted a YouTube link to particle physics talk, really fascinating. I don't know if they might have more than 30% of fabricated research, really interesting. The difference is with particle physics, you don't change clinical practice. So I think with medicine, you actually have a lot more impact when you fabricate research, and in physics, they spend a lot of money and hopes. So yes, very, very important comments. I want to get back to the question that was posted in the chat from Atavi Amato, asking about artificial intelligence and synthetic data arms being produced for data sets and what is the situation with that, and whether synthetic arms might worsen the situation with fraud, or could the transformations brought about by artificial intelligence be fruitful chance to take into account the problem of fraud as well? And that follows with my question to Ben, considering the trends that you spot in data. I would think it would be quite easy to train artificial intelligence to do that and scrape big volumes of articles to identify systematically, automatically these articles, and then send them to people like yourselves to recheck, which leads me to another question. How do you check articles? Do you just pick something, or you only check articles which you happen to be reading and then you question? So sorry, it's a lot of questions, but start with
a couple of questions. So my response on the detection in relation to AI and better production of problematic articles. Yes, I hear this question a lot, but if you listen carefully to my talk, then our problem is not detection. Our problem is the response. So I'm actually not so, that is a second question for me. If we are really having a good system and we respond good on what we see, then you're going to have the question, do we really see everything? But with, I mean, these papers that I showed in these 900 papers, it is really unbelievable that is still out there, right? I could fill an hour every week with all the examples of what these editors are accepting and letting go. So the discussion is not what happens if better fabricators come. The discussion is why are we not responding on the clearly problematic work that is currently out there. So that is one answer. And then your other question was, how do I work? Well, I work with my checklist, so to say. Not automatic. So we talk with people who can help us in kind of transferring the algorithms in automatic searches. But I have worked now with a student from the University of Amsterdam who has a plagiarism checker from the university. I think the things he finds also is unbelievable that the journals have not found that themselves, right? So that is one thing, and then put things always in Google, always put an email address of an author in Google, and that gives a lot of surprising findings, so to say. But on the other hand, the problem is also not so big, right? If we would really, I called Egypt with Iran, I think is an equal problem. But if we would just go to 10 universities in Egypt and we should collectively say, this is not acceptable, then the problem is solved. But we don't dare to do that. I mean, another problem I touched upon that is that the journals do not collaborate in terms of investigation. There is no mechanism that says, now we are going to collect everything from one author. At once, we're going to ask that author to show his underlying data. And at once, we are going to approach his, mostly, or her institute. I mean, that should be so simple to organize, but we don't do that.
Thank you, Ben, for this comment. So we have another question in the chat. I observed that most of the fraud studies were clinical trials and not other types of studies. Is that true? And why would that be the case? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so my estimate is, or actually Ivan Suransky's estimate from Retraction Watch is that 2% of the papers, all the medical papers is fabricated, but from the RCTs that is 30%. And there are two reasons for that. RCTs are, if you do them, real expensive. So the percentage of RCTs in the trustworthy literature is low because it's so expensive to do them. But if you're going to fabricate, you're not going to be hampered by that problem, because fabrication of an RCT is equally cheap as fabrication of a non-RCT. So you're going to have much more RCTs in the fabricated stuff. And the second reason to do that is RCTs are attractive. So if you want to increase your publication chances, then you fabricate an RCT, so to say. So that explains for me the 2% in the general literature as compared to the 30% RCTs. And you saw that also in the picture that we made in relation to GDP. So Egypt and Iran are just countries that you would not expect there as the number 1 and 2 RCT countries around the world. If you look at the number of papers, the number of RCTs in times of the medal ranking of the Olympics, right? And if you for every Olympic Games, it's always the US and China and Russia and Europe. You expect them there based on their size. But Egypt and Iran are not to be expected there based on their size. And the reason is fabrication is not costing any.
Thank you very much, Ben. We are out of time, but I have one last question leading from your answer. Fabrication and zombie trials. Have you looked what do people put for funding for zombie trials? And is there a difference? So my assumptions from your talk is that fabricated trials could have had a proper funder, and when the results were not as impressive, they might change a few numbers. And zombie trials, is there any money behind that?
No, nothing. But that, I mean, that is another reason why these editors and publishers should take action. I mean, how can you kind of accept that somebody submits a paper with samples an RCT with 1,500 women without any funding, right? That is just impossible. I think one of the problems also, well, I mean, it's late at night here, so I can make this last comment, is that the majority of the editors and the publishers don't know what they're talking about themselves also, right? I mean, what they let go in terms of papers, I mean, everybody can see that could never happen, but because they don't have enough understanding of research, I really make myself unpopular here, they accept these papers, so to say. And one criterion should be if you submit a large RCT and you don't have any funding, then you should explain how that happened. So that in itself, actually, you just enriched my checklist with another item. I'm going to adjust the checklist.
Excellent. Okay.